Okay, so let's give it a couple of minutes. See, Alessandro and Stuart, you're the only people with proper shirts on. So thank you. Congratulations. The trouble is I've been stuck in my bedroom for so long, I can't sort of remember what the clothes are, right?
You still got the same T-shirt on, Sam? Yes, good man.
Of course.
Excellent.
This was actually, so what I was told, so I picked this up at COP26, and apparently it was a sort of mass production lot from 2015. So Figueres and team apparently were sending around their, they'd sort of had loads printed, and apparently whoever it was who gave it to me, they've got on the tail end of this huge inventory they're trying to get rid of. So I was just delighted. It was great. Doesn't quite fit, but it doesn't matter. It's the original thing. So. Minutes. It's very calming background you've got there, Stuart. Honourine, hi.
Hi.
Hello, Sam.
How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. And you?
Now you're confusing me now because you said don't call you Tambe, but call you Honourine, right? But your name.
Yeah, Honourine is better. Honourine is my name. Tambe is my father's name. So.
Okay, so let's just make sure I'm going to change my name from Zoom as well. Okay, fantastic. So let us start. So welcome panelists and contributors. Thank you very much indeed. Welcome everybody who is watching this live or watching this afterwards. Piet, sorry, so we do have Piet, but I think he's coming as a participant. Let me just. Sorry, everybody. I'll just crack on. So, yeah, so my name's Sam Baker, and I'm speaking really on behalf of everybody who has been contributing to an initiative I'm running, Walk2COP27. And I'm speaking to, I guess, really everybody. So everybody who's concerned about climate change, but also, of course, the people who aren't concerned about climate change or perhaps don't feel they know or need to know enough in some cases. So just a couple of words I'll say about COP, because part of this initiative is trying to keep the focus on COP, keep the understanding and conversation around COP alive. Part of that is what we're trying to do with our initiative. But also, of course, it is just, I mean, we all know it is just critically important, coming at a critically important time. So I'm not a aficionado of COPs. I haven't been to many COPs. COP26 was the first one I went to. I didn't get to the blue zone. So I'm not an expert, but so I'm sort of an external, if you like, observer. And my observation around COP26 was, of course, first of all, it was a phenomenal event in terms of numbers of people and the depth and breadth of types of people who got involved in some shape or form, including the demonstrations. It was remarkable in many, many ways. But I think for those of us who aren't seasoned observers, it was quite disappointing when we saw the climate pact. So the Glasgow Climate Pact that came out. And perhaps I just point to one thing which was particularly disappointing is this debate and narrative that went around the mention of coal and the absence of any mention in the same vein of oil and gas. And to somebody who isn't close to COP and the great effort that apparently the great efforts that has resulted in that outcome, this is extraordinary. It's just extraordinary. It's not commensurate with real life and what's happening. So obviously goods and bads, and probably the biggest miss in COP26 was the fact that we were hoping that we were going to get a set of nationally defined contributions, so national plans, which were going to keep us within 2 degrees as per the Paris Agreement, if not 1.5. And everybody was hoping for that. Of course, we missed it by a long mark. The estimates of where we might be as a result of those, I think the lowest is probably 2.4. So a long way north of the 1.5 degrees that we all hope for. So the context since then has been pretty torrid and complexing for all of us. And first of all, of course, we've had the tail end of COVID. We've had the supply chain challenges from COVID that came as a result of 2 years of COVID. But of course, we've also had the war. We've had the incredible sort of geopolitical gyrations we've had around the war, but also exacerbating the supply chain and making an energy crisis out of this for many economies. So all of those things have really grabbed huge amounts of attention, both of the public, but of course, probably more importantly, from the politicians. So a huge sort of grab for attention, which of course has deprioritized to a large extent climate, and in some cases has sent it backwards. So in some cases, the increase in energy prices has resulted in some acceleration of energy and the desire to embrace energy. Of course, in others, it's gone backwards. And certainly in the UK, we've got fracking back on the agenda. We've got, the minister in charge talking about squeezing the last drop of oil out of the North Sea. So, in terms of rhetoric and narrative, we have gone backwards, unfortunately. So the context is challenging. And of course, the macro context on all of this is the fact that, first of all, we see emissions continuing to rise. And so no evidence of a dramatic snap to the reductions that we hope in order to keep us at least even aligned to that 2.4, that we know we've got to radically cut emissions this decade. We're not seeing that at a global level. It's continuing to increase. And of course, we're also seeing the mass implications of climate change and the changing the weather patterns. And of course, attribution is always difficult, but Pakistan and then Hurricane Ian and these are just enormous local economic and societal events happening in these countries for these parts of society. So, and of course, very expensive as well to try and repair and reconstruct. And huge social cost in terms of dislocation, lives and livelihoods. So I guess that's the background. So what do we hope for from COP27? It is billed as implementation. So it is supposed to be about implementing. We've done with the rule setting and the conversation, the targets, and now we move on to implementation. That would be nice. If that's the spirit with which these conversations are conducted at COP27, fantastic. I think we've all got, we wait to see the evidence of that. In terms of the mitigation, so the sort of emissions reduction, it is incumbent on, all countries have actually agreed, as far as I understand, to upgrade their nationally, or at least look at their nationally defined contributions, their plans to reduce emissions. And we hope that they will produce a refined set which keeps us more within or in line with the Paris Agreement. I think at last count, and I haven't seen this for a week, that somebody was talking about a number of 18. So just 18 plans have been revised so far since COP26. So whatever the number, it's not enormous, and it probably doesn't include the biggest economies or the biggest emitting economies. So, so the mitigation is really obviously important to get another set of NDCs out, another commitment to the Paris Agreement, and just keep everybody absolutely on it. And also, of course, just begin to see some evidence that these plans are actually being put into practice. And then on adaptation, or resilience, whichever sort of side of the coin you want to talk about, I think many of us feel that that's been an element of response to climate change that has really been something which has been underplayed for lots of reasons. But there's been a big focus on net zero, particularly at corporate level, but also at national level. And this idea of sort of resilience and adaptation, which is a little bit more complex, it's more complex to define. That's been rather neglected in comparison, although of course the implications in terms of the short-term impacts can be very, very significant. So there is a push to put that further up the agenda, to finance that better. So we're talking about developed countries doubling the finance that they put forward for resilience and adaptation. But also there's this thorny issue, and I'm sure that we'll hear about this maybe from Kevin and also from Honourine, about loss and damage. So, what is climate justice? What does loss and damage actually mean? How should we begin to think about whose fault it is, who's benefited effectively from the current situation in the past, and therefore, economically, what is their responsibility for instance, Pakistan have got a fraction of the emissions, but a major part of the outcome. So I think, loss and damage was on the agenda, was put on the agenda last time. We had some notional payments like Scotland, but it wasn't really a sort of formal part of it. And I think clearly there's a push to make that a more formal part of this COP. So, I mean, and we can sort of hope for obviously much, much more. So some of the bilateral arrangements were quite interesting during COP26. We had the China-US, which unfortunately has now disappeared, but we had that sort of agreement. So we hope for lots of exciting, you know, bilateral or sort of informal, outside of the UNFCCC formal process agreements too. The most important thing for me is just to try and keep the focus of people like us on it. So perhaps people who aren't in the blue zone, don't have the accredited, you know, or maybe some of you do, but, you know, I haven't got the accreditation go to the blue zone. I want to be interested in COP. I want to try and understand it. I want to talk to people about it, and I want to keep it on my annual agenda as a really, really important thing. And so I think, but part of Walk2COP27, as I said, is an initiative to try and get the opportunity to get people around to talk about it and talk about the issues implied by it. So we do begin, all of us, to understand how important it is, what an important date in the calendar, and how important it is that the people there know that we're thinking about it, looking at it, and making and having great expectations. So just a little bit about COP, and please, you guys, when you know have your floor, then, you know, put me right or chip in or say other things. But the second bit of what I wanted to say was just about the initiative that we're running, so Walk2COP27. So this is really mass participation. So the idea is to mobilize as many people as possible to engage in and around climate action. And the main sort of sources or types of people I've been going for are students, businesses and employees, environmental NGOs, but NGOs more broadly, local authorities, but also faith groups. So trying to get people from those different areas to come together. The intention is threefold. So we want to create a platform which allows people to learn, to share opinions. And today is a very important part of that. So you expressing your opinions and perspectives and people hearing that. The second is trying to develop and create some sense of solidarity. So bring lots of people together to sort of feel like we're at least sharing this common issue and thinking about responses together. And then the third is connections. It's just people making connections, whether it's you guys, you panelists, or whether it's people who are walking with us or whoever else it might be, people making connections, which just gets further forward towards climate action. And we keep hearing about collaboration, particularly within business, and how important that is. That doesn't happen unless people know each other. You know, people have to know each other and make those connections. So those are the three objectives. And the way that you can engage is fourfold. So the first one is to get on the app and walk with us. So we've got, at last count, we've got 1,200 people signed up to an app as individuals, but as a part of a team. So that might be their organization, their employee, their football club, or whatever else. So they sign up and then they walk, and they're walking with us wherever they are. They track their distance, walked or run or cycled or traveled in a wheelchair. They can track that distance. And we imagine that we're walking from Scotland all the way to COP27. We chalk up that distance, we post selfies, we give each other high fives. And importantly, that distance translates into trees planted in Burundi by the Jane Goodall Institute. So, you know, it's a bit of fun, but the main point is that we all think we're part of some sort of climate, you know, collective or engagement. So that's that. And we're continuing to build it. So everybody listening, please investigate that, get a team going, get on it. The second bit is then the town halls like this. So getting people together to talk about a national context, or to have people within a national context to talk about climate change, really important. And we've arranged those. So it started in Scotland, it ends in Egypt. So we get that sense of that journey going through. The third is Clubhouse. So we've got an inventory of about 32 Clubhouse sessions. So any of the participants can choose to lead a Clubhouse session. So Stuart, thank you. You're going to lead one. Looking forward to that. And the idea is that people can then obviously access those Clubhouse sessions and access the learning and the perspectives provided in a slightly more informal session. And the final one is just social media. So if we can amplify the good things you're doing, fantastic. And as we build mass and we build walkers and we build people that we can market it to, we want to amplify what people are doing, people's perspectives, and make this whole thing more important and bigger in all our minds and everything that we do. So thank you very much indeed. So just in terms of today, let me just very quickly share my screen. So it's a little bit. So in terms of today, we're going to split it into two panels. So the first panel, we have Alessandro, Jonas, and Kevin. So they'll introduce themselves. They'll spend about 4 minutes talking about their perspective. And then we will cycle through some questions, and we can certainly have questions from the floor as well. So Alessandro, looking forward to a very interesting set of comments in and around a very important industry. And of course, every industry, it's incumbent on them to think about their own footprint, but perhaps more importantly, think about the footprint that they are influencing in the broader world. So any and all commentary around that is going to be super interesting. We've got Jonas, who is climate change and climate action focused and part of the Shift, which is a partnership with the WWF. So we look forward to hearing about that. And then Kevin, who majors on climate justice. And again, I think that's a underemphasized area and domain. Really looking forward to hearing that as well. And then we'll go into panel 2. So we'll have Piet from Wood Architects, who's also Climate Reality Project leader. We've got Stuart, who you can see he'll introduce himself, but he's a professional program manager as his day job, but as his sort of night job, he is a professional, I suppose, let's call it a professional pursuer of emissions and how to reduce them on a personal basis. And then we have Honourine. So Honourine, really looking forward to your contribution as well, to hear about ACEF. So this is climate change in Africa, but you're based in Belgium as well, so you've got a good perspective there, and very much look forward to hearing that. So that's who we are. So can we start, and can we just have, so stay on that first panel. Let's have Alessandro, followed by Jonas, followed by Kevin. So about 4 minutes of your perspective, pass it on. We'll keep an eye on Q&A. Stuart and Honourine, you can come off camera if you want, you can stay on camera, it's up to you, but let's kick off. So Alessandro, please.
Thanks so much, Sam, and hello to the other speakers and to anybody who tuned in to listen to us. So I'll bring you today my personal view on COP27 from 2 perspectives. One is the industry one from ETNO, we represent European telecom companies, and the other one is an association that I'm board member of called the Global Enabling Sustainability Initiative, JESI, that promotes the uptake of ICT as a way to achieve basically ESG. So pretty much a private sector view of the world. The first one, as an observer in the private sector, I think that the thing that concerns me the most at the moment is of course, how political maybe the ESG debate and the debate around the environmental targets has become. It concerns me, but at the same time, it gives me some positive vibes, because when something becomes political, it means that there is finally a real conversation happening out there. However, the first thing that we reflect on in the industry is the fact that as things become political, they risk also becoming partisan. So we have been used in the past 10-15 years that the environmental targets are something that is established by scientists. And that's why in the industry, we refer so much to the so-called SBTs, the science-based targets, that have become a bit of a lighthouse. Of course, if things become political, it means that you elevate this discussion on what the science has found out, and you share it with people more broadly, with stakeholders. That's good. But if it becomes partisan, then we might have a problem, because if we end up having the science-based targets as being perceived something that is linked only to one party or one fraction in the political spectrum, this will make it also more difficult for industry to walk towards those targets. The second aspect is around the crisis that we are living. I believe, Sam, you mentioned it. What started as a very dramatic and sad war that is still happening just a few miles from here is now turning also into a crisis on energy sources and on inflation more broadly. Here, maybe one interesting thing is that the political discourse in Brussels is one that is very aware of how the short-term needs imposed by the crisis need to be separated from the long-term objectives. And in this sense, I believe that the European Commission is giving a very useful frame of mind here, because what they are telling to stakeholders, what they are telling to member states, and what they're working on is the fact that if you want to become independent from fossil fuels, and especially fossil fuels from Russia, let's face it, then you need to accelerate the green transition. So in a way, if it sets us back in the short term, hopefully it provides double, if not 3 times the determination that we need to go there. And then I can get a bit more into the details of what I mean by this. I have a last thing, and this is purely from the experience in our industry. You hinted at it, Sam. There is how we look in the telecom industry at the sustainability targets, especially in the environmental field, is always first by looking at what we need to do to reduce our own carbon footprint. And second is how can we use the services and networks that telecommunication operators are building to empower others to reduce their own emissions. And in both cases, the transition to the new generation of networks is proving especially crucial. Because we know from studies, one of which you also participated to, Sam, that the transition to full 5G and full fiber networks, which are the latest generation networks, can reduce significantly the use of energy and therefore the emissions that come from our sector, because they are far more efficient technologies. At the same time, they provide a very interesting platform for other industrial sectors. I'm thinking of manufacturing, but also of transports, to dramatically reduce their own emissions. So we always look at our own CO2 reduction, but also at what we call the enabling potential. So to conclude, I hope that one of the big messages that will come out also from COP27 is that adoption of new technologies and of digital technologies, namely, can and should be one big driver of public policies that are aimed at reducing CO2 emissions. I'm looking forward to listening to the colleagues now.
Jonas. Thank you, Alessandro.
Yes, thank you, Sam, and thank you, Alessandro, for this interesting introduction to your ETNO. So I'm here as I'm the climate responsible for the Shift. The Shift is the biggest Belgian sustainability network. We comprise over more than 500 different organizations, the majority of which are companies, but also NGOs, academia, government institutes, civil society organizations, etc. We work on sustainability in a broad sense. I won't go into detail. I'm the climate responsible at the Shift, and the majority of my time goes into an initiative, a joint initiative between the Shift and WWF Belgium, which is called the Belgian Alliance for Climate Action. It's this subgroup of the Shift members emerged at some point 3 years ago when companies were saying we need to do something more for the climate. And at that point, we started discussing with WWF Belgium and Science Based Targets Initiative. And so it's a group of the Shift members that are in the process of or have already set science-based targets. So they are, and we're very strict. These are the criteria to join. So if you don't make science-based targets, if you don't validate your science-based targets on time, we ask you to come back when you have them validated within a time frame. And the goal is really to, for us, there's 3 things that are really important, and that is we need to act now. So all these companies that are with us, they're convinced that they need to do something now, not just because they want to save the world, but this is something, and I'll come back to that later, but also because decarbonization also brings opportunities for the private sector. The second one is that we need to do it based on science. So there's a lot of systems that allow you to pledge carbon neutrality in decades. but we need to do something now, and it needs to be something that is based on science. So it's a fair transition for everyone, and the organizations that emit more, they also take more responsibility, I would say. And the last bit is that we need to do it together. I think this is a transition that is taking a lot of time, effort. It's everybody's on unknown terrain, so it makes sense to work together. And this is very much what we're doing with the Belgian Alliance for Climate Action. We are, as you like, the network around science-based targets in Belgium. So we do share a lot of knowledge on the, we share a lot of information on the events, on carbon footprinting, on SBTs. We share best practices and lessons learned via testimonials of our members. We create visibility for our members, and especially the ones with the validated SBTs, because this is not an it's not easy to get there and to follow the track. So we do want to give them the, if we ask for testimonials, these are the companies that we put forward. And the last bit is the networking, the networking section, because this is, in our opinion, this is crucial. We can and we need to share our experience in this journey, and this is very, very important to the Bocka community. So there's two things I would like to highlight today. First of all, and this is something, a message that we are trying to give, and it's not easy. It's for some reason not a lot of people, especially politicians, don't find it hard to understand. But the private sector, as the biggest emitter in Europe, should and is ready to take its responsibility in terms of decarbonization, I should say. I find it sometimes strange that we keep looking into governments and citizens alone, and whereas companies are responsible for a big chunk of the emissions and should take their responsibility for it, and are happy to do so, at least some of them. Because, and this is the second point, it's the realization when I talk to the members in our community, and I'm well aware that this is a community of more, I mean, there's a bias because they're front runners, and these are companies that are already convinced. But the feedback I get on a daily basis is that that they're looking into decarbonization, not just because they want to save the planet, but also because it's crucial for them to shift their business model. It's crucial for them in terms of marketing and HR. It's a topic that is not linked to just being the green dogma of we need to save the planet, but it's a crucial pathway for companies to take if they want to survive in the future and take the opportunities that come with it. And then this, my second point is, as I would have to agree with Alessandro, the fear of the short term, especially now when we're now in the energy prices are really high. There's for sure other crises that are coming up with rare earth metals, with water crises that will come in the future for sure. So this is something we will be forced, the system will be forced to think on the short term, and we need to keep the long-term perspective in mind. It's too easy to go for quick wins. We need to keep this future perspective and this vision. We need to keep our eyes on the future. And this is also something that we're pushing very hard at this time, that not to go for easy wins, but go for future-proof wins at this stage.
Okay, Jonas, thank you. And just to sort of segue into you, Kevin. So the way that we've framed as part of Walk2COP27, we've framed climate action in terms of four things. The first is decarbonisation. So obviously, Alessandro and Jonas, you've majored on that, and a lot of businesses do. The second is resilience, which is the outcome of adaptation, and whether that be, a supply chain, a community, the world, a country. So, fraught with challenge, and we are a Race to Resilience partner, but that's second. The third then is justice, which we've pulled out, which I guess, Kevin, is a segue to you, but, the idea of incorporating people in the decision-making, being fair, not leaving anybody behind. And then the fourth, which you've just touched on, Jonas, is circularity. So really just trying to make sure that whatever we build as a result of this, we don't have a knee-jerk reaction, build something which possibly does resolve one of those other things, and particularly emissions, but doesn't then store up something which bites the next generation, possibly just as badly. So those are the four things we're doing. So Kevin, please, over to you.
So hi everyone, it's really nice to meet all of you and be invited here. So I'm Kevin, I'm working for the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, and I'm also doing research into applying principles of climate justice to policy. So that's looking at the polluter pays principle, ability to pay, emissions egalitarianism, and all those more normative principles. And so I think one of the main points I want to make ahead of COP27 is that there's a real risk of seeing increased polarization between the developing world and the developed world, with wealthy nations being lambasted for failing to pull through on their commitments in terms of climate finance. And I think this is a very important topic, and that's why we need moral principles, fundamental moral principles that can underpin climate action to create a grand bargain that makes it possible for cooperation to happen at COP27 and avoid the situation in which developing nations brandish a right to develop further, although legitimate, but then nothing is done in a coherent way because there isn't that grand bargain to make sure that the costs are allocated in a just way. So I guess that would be my first point. And so then regarding the whole idea of leaving no one behind, which we hear a lot in the EU. So FEPS is a think tank, and we're working especially alongside the Socio-Democrats in Parliament. I think there's a real risk that just transition in the EU can be done at the cost of global just transition, because there are impacts. We live in an interdependent world, and there are impacts of making sure that we leave no one behind in the EU will mean that we have negative effects on supply chains across the world, and we have negative impacts across the world. So one of these examples perhaps that can speak to us is wind energy. So I think it's easy to agree on renewables. We want renewables. It's the lesser of two evils. But then when we look at where the materials and the real resources come from, we realize that most of the wood used in wind turbines is sourced in Bolivian rainforests. So we're fueling deforestation with local green growth, right? And we need to find future-proof solutions, as Jonas said, and we need to make sure that we're not just shifting the problem and the injustices elsewhere for future generations. We can't decarbonize, but then see that we've actually passed other tipping points in terms of biodiversity, forests, etc. So that would be my main point. And then perhaps a quick reaction as well to the comments on the energy crisis. I think right now we're understanding it as an energy crisis, but a crisis is something that doesn't last through time. It's something that happens and then prices go back down. However, with what we're seeing right now and the green transition, this is likely, the high costs of energy are likely going to stick around. So it's probably going to stay that way. And so it makes it even more important not to have this short-term perspective of mitigating the energy crisis as a short-term problem when we need more systemic transformation to make sure that we have the redistributive mechanisms in place to make sure that we have also social justice, because we can't have climate action without social justice, and we can't have social justice without climate action either, because the impacts of climate change are going to be so catastrophic that we need all communities to be resilient and adapt. So that's, I would say, my final point, and perhaps linking a little bit to what was said previously.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Kevin. Okay, so typically what I've done in these sessions is just step through some generic questions, and then, you know, in a reasonably logical order, hopefully. And what we're going to do is we've got the outcomes of all of the different town halls, but we're also going to have a mass collaborative session before we get into Egypt. So we're going to ask the same questions. And those are broadly, the first one focuses on the challenge. So how do we see the challenge ourselves in our local areas? So Jonas, I'm going to ask you about that, and you know, how's it being felt perhaps a little bit more locally, or by the businesses you're interacting with, or even for your private life. So that's one. So how, you know, reflections on what it's actually feeling like and what the challenge is. The second is then trying to think about responses that we think are, you know, a reasonable level of granularity that we think are worth talking about. So maybe Alessandro, again, people in your stable, maybe they're doing some really interesting things. So Let's talk about a sort of response. Possibly, Kevin, there might be some interesting comparisons between countries about who's been more progressive around this and having better thinking. The third then is, how do we scale what we're doing? Because there's a lot of talk about the technology exists, we know what we're supposed to do. How do we scale? So thoughts on scaling. And then the final one is really just stepping back and saying, okay, everybody, what one or two things do we think is absolutely critical to put in place in order to speed up the transition? And we can think about that sort of locally or nationally rather than perhaps globally, but we can do both. And what was interesting, by the way, is that so this is the fourth town hall. The French one came out with a very different conclusion to Scotland and England. So I won't tell you what that is until the end. So perhaps we could just start on that first question. So when we're thinking about how this impacts us, how so people, obviously we talked about Bugstar, we talked about the US, there's flooding in Belgium, but Jonas, how do people talk about it, the challenge of climate change? How do they feel it?
Just a quick question. How long do we have per question? Do you want me to keep it short and snappy, or?
Yeah, short and snappy, please.
Yeah.
We've got another panel. And,
yeah. I see.
Yeah.
So when I just a side note that the organizations that I talked with, they are already convinced of the fact that we need to do something about sustainability. So I would like to differentiate the two. In general, I think maybe I'm just an optimistic person, but I'm slightly optimistic in the sense that the people I've been talking to, they manage to talk about climate change now and see it as not as we're doomed and we need to. It doesn't make any sense to do anything. It is a good call to action, I feel. People are ready to, and I think the realization is coming that we can do some. I mean, it's not the most complex of issues, climate change. It's reducing emissions and making sure we don't go over limits. It's like it's what we do in our cars. I don't have a car, but what we do in cars every day. It's not going over the speed limit. So it's not the most complex. I think it's more about behavioral change, and I think a lot of organizations are working very well now into making that behavioral change and making sure that we focus on the right things and not on the wrong things and not give in to fear, but use it. There's a lot of really good examples, I would say, of how we are communicating about climate and all the change, all the crises that continue from the climate crisis. So yeah, I think slightly optimistic, I must say. But
okay, so Jonas, I'm just going to push you on that. So yeah. Great, I love hearing optimism. Mm-hmm. But I guess so for instance, in London, we heard from Arriva, who manage train tracks, and apparently, unlike Spain, the steel that they use, and I'm probably getting this wrong technically, but the steel that they use effectively isn't really fit for purpose above whatever it was, 43 degrees or something. Mm-hmm. And our summer, we just hit 42 degrees. So, as a business, they're thinking, oh my goodness, this is a massive, real local impact, which actually is fundamental to my entire business if I'm a business. I think, having walked from London to Glasgow last year for COP26, people were concerned at different places in the country about different things. But I think it was the uncertainty and the unspoken fear, which is probably the biggest pervading impact, because they read about it, but they didn't want to be impacted. We do have flooding, and we have had a very hot summer, but it was the anticipation more than anything else. Yeah. In other countries, of course, that's very different. So just okay, it's good that they've realized they've got to change, but are they feeling it, or how are they feeling it?
Yeah, just a side note that I don't necessarily work specifically on civil society and communication with them. So it's mainly with organizations, with universities, with companies. So of course there's a discrepancy there, but I think and again, there's a bias because my friends are all probably convinced that we need to do something about the climate. I think fear will always be there. I think the more we go in a direction, the more we're faced with the consequences of climate crisis and the results that they have. And I think it will make the fear a bit more. It will make the situation more tangible. And this is always I think fear comes out of unknown and uncertainty, and the more we are faced with issues, I think the more we can learn how to deal with them. There will be there will always be fear, and there will always be uncertainty. I think what we haven't been seeing up to now is the fact that we can offer sometimes a solution, or we can come up with something to fix things. And the more we see problems being fixed, I think the more we will get a better overview of what we can do as a society, and what fears are relevant and what fears are irrelevant. And hopefully it will make us get out of our bubble of inaction. So yeah, this is, I think, my point of view on the matter.
All right, Jonas, thank you. And so Alessandro, Kevin, did you just, before we go into sort of responses, any reflections on that? So how is it being felt?
I think it's very practical. I'm thinking of our sector, telecoms. Floods were a threat to the integrity of networks, not this summer, but the earlier summer. You might remember the floods in the south of Belgium and in Germany. It means that you had to go in and replace entire parts of the networks. And that's very real, very material, if you wish. This is said, on the solution side, it's also very practical and it's business driven. I'm looking at 3 use cases that we are promoting lately, which, by the way, come from the work that the European Green Digital Coalition is doing. The European Green Digital Coalition is a mixed public-private coalition funded by the EU, of which ETNO is one of the funding members, where we are trying to come up with the agreed or scientifically solid calculator to define what is the net enabling potential of the ICT industry. And in order to do that, we need to come up with use cases that are really supported by hardcore data that show how by adopting that use case, you can reduce emissions. And there is 3, one from Telefonica, that is the traditional fleet optimization use case, in which with the 4G or 5G, you can enable a fleet manager of a transport company to dramatically reduce the use of fuel, but also the CO2 emissions. Another one is from Ericsson, that uses a 5G in the port of Livorno in Italy, where basically, thanks to the real-time monitoring of what's happening in the port, they are able to optimize significantly the cargo movements. This is again a gain to the logistical companies, but it's a major gain in CO2 emissions. And the last one that I found very interesting is in agriculture. It's always a 5G one. From Liberty Global, where basically they use 5G connected drones to map the crops in a detail, with a lot of details, so that they can understand where the bedweed is growing, and they can target the use of herbicides much more than in the previous world, which means that they use less herbicides. These are very, very practical things in terms of solutions, and they are also business cases.
Yeah, very much so. So Kevin, moving to you. So either you know, the challenge that climate change presents and how it's being felt, or moving on to, you know, solutions. So, you know, you've outlined a very obviously a conceptual and a very important framework, and a big step really from where we are, to be honest. So are there sort of signs, you know, are there things that you're seeing on the way that gives you confidence, or small solution, local solutions?
So I think from, you know, talking to flatmates, talking to people that aren't necessarily in your line of work and in your immediate circles, there has been a bit of a turning point this summer. And with the floods in Pakistan, people are a bit like Thomas in the Bible. People need to feel the wounds of Jesus to know that he exists. But the problem here is that when you start touching those wounds, it might already be that the window of opportunity to act is really closing really fast. And so I do feel like more people are aware of the problem of climate change. You encounter climate skeptics way less as a general rule. But then in terms of the actions and the road to get there, I think there's still this very strong belief that sometimes the changes that are needed to respond to it are a bit surface level, as in shifting to green growth and not reconceptualizing and rethinking some very fundamental things which impact our behavior as citizens, right? So yeah, that would be my initial take on the progression of attitudes, perhaps.
Yeah, interesting. And I think that certainly it's come through in all of the discussions we've had so far, where you have a portion of the people thinking about system change. So to your point about green growth, does it really exist? Do we have, is it right to have a system configured or dependent on driving growth? Or are we not going to be just in competition with a system like that? To obviously then people thinking about working within the system and making some tweaks, to people feeling there's a sort of more of a free market potential solution here. So yeah, we've had opinions spread across those. And, at the moment, you probably think, Jonas and Alessandro are, promoting good business practice effectively. So within the existing system, and maybe Kevin, it sounds like you're possibly thinking that green growth might be more of an illusion than others might think. So perhaps we can come to that in a minute. And I think, so the last two questions really we'll bring together. So, it's great to hear about proper, granular, pragmatic things. And Alessandro, of course, we could listen to it for hours and really dig into it and be fascinating. But I hope, people will go off and have a look at it themselves. It's great to hear the confidence and the SBTs, but the adherence to the SBTs, Jonas, that you're driving. But obviously it's not enough. It's not enough at a national level. It's not enough at a global level. We've got to do far, far more. So I guess before we go into our final question, the next one is scaling. So how do we make a fundamental change from our sort of perspectives in what we're doing? How do we make that leap? Because yeah, it's great that we're all beginning to get it, and that's what I felt in the UK. 2/3 of the pupils at a school class, they all put up their hands and said they knew what COP was. Fantastic. But how do we move to actually doing something and doing something really significant at the heart of how we live, the heart of our businesses, the heart of our organizations? So that scaling point is very much on our mind. So any reflections of any of you just around that change in moving from great examples, fantastic pragmatic examples of what we could do, to something which is actually more fundamentally at the heart of what we do?
Can I maybe chip in on this one? There is a quote that I like a lot from the mayor of Bergamo, which was one of the hardest hit towns by the pandemic. Giorgio Gori, who is center-left, by the way, Partito Democratico. And he said that the only way to fight populism is to do things, to bring solutions. So there is a lot of criticism, fear, understandable fear among people and among stakeholders as to what technology adoption will mean, but also as to what the green transition means. And it's interesting how we see in Brussels that the green and digital transitions are framed as something that goes hand in hand. They go together. The way to respond to these fears is also to bring practical solutions. And I agree with Kevin, you cannot just turn the green wave into just another business opportunity. And you need to invest and focus on things like circularity, replacing things, changing the way in which you produce, in which you distribute, and so on. But in doing so, you also need to create a dividend for people, because without people, we cannot do anything. And in this, I like the intuition of Vice President Timmermans at the European Commission, and of this European Commission that talks about a just transition. And for the just transition, you need to have the businesses on board and try to walk there together towards COP or towards any other thing. So if we bring solutions, I'm confident that we will be able to bring also people on board.
Yeah, and I think that your point about the dividend for the people, it's important, I think, that people can, it's not just the dividend of de-risking the future, because that's an extraordinarily difficult thing to experience. Less risk than the risk the increased risk in the future that you don't have at the moment is reduced, and therefore it's a dividend. That's a very difficult thing to experience and really feel. And I think Princey Bourne, so this was a panelist on our French town hall. So she's in charge of the sort of ecologists in the Grand Metropole Paris. And I'm probably mispronouncing that, but anyway. So her point was quality of life. She used the word quality of life, connecting quality of life improvements to any form of climate action. And I think that's, for me, that was much, much more tangible and appropriate than, either something like happiness or something like finance, but quality of life. I thought it was a great way of, thinking exactly as you said, the dividend. How should the dividend be expressed? As an improved quality of life, or at least some aspects of it. Jonas, please.
It's always a struggle with the mute button. There's two, I completely agree with this. I think two observations from my end that I would like to share with you all, and that's maybe on a scale of companies. I see that there's a willingness to. The other day we have one of our companies, ETAP Lighting, and they went from a traditional lighting fixture company to an as a service model, which, if you look at it from different points of view, it's a great model. Like climate wise, it helps you incredibly to reduce your Scope 3 emissions. But in terms of quality and the interaction with your customers, it's another way of working. But for them, it's been very beneficial. And I see a lot of companies looking at new business models. And I think we need to, and this will be the segue to my next point. We need to start talking about, in a hopeful way, about other ways of consuming. We cannot promote growth until eternity. We need to stop thinking about other scenarios and putting them forward as not being the doom scenarios, but I mean, it doesn't. To get the example of COVID during the pandemic and the confinement, there were a lot of things that we had to change our behavior getting out of it. I see now a lot of people are cherishing more quality time and being at home or having time to develop yourself. I think there is potential for this. I think we can go to a scenario that doesn't make you, doesn't have to make people think that they will only eat potatoes and have candlelight instead of electrical light in winter. And this is, I think these are things that we need to actively push and create awareness around. And then there's also, I think, a couple of never underestimate the power of people. I think when we were talking about France, then there is a great initiative called the Shifters, or the Shift Project, and they are doing incredible work in Belgium. I mean, they're also active in Belgium. They listed they have a program, Education for Climate, and they're just listing all the courses at all Belgian universities and haute école. I don't know what practical universities in English. I don't know what the exact term is, but they're listing all the education masters and programs that actively include climate, and then they go to the university and say, you see, this is only 10% of your of what you offer. You might want to amp it up a little. And I think it's a really clever way of connecting people with a need for more climate education and showing universities and academia that there's a real need for it and that you need to amp it up. So I think these are all initiatives that help creating a field for these kind of activities and making it clear that we need to talk about another future. We cannot think about, I mean, the word growth is maybe something that we shouldn't be using anymore.
Yeah, well stated. Kevin.
I think to also bounce off what Alessandro was saying on twin transition in the EU, it's also interesting to see how that works then externally to the European Union, right? Because we're talking a lot about twin transition within the EU, but then in a European to Middle East, North African external cooperation, it barely exists. So there's barely any climate cooperation, and then on the digital side, it's close to nothing, which is something that we're actually working on at FEPS at the moment. And so that's just a reaction, random thought, if you will. And then my other point was also on scaling up. So to scale up, I think we need less regulation, or regulation that better helps clean tech, and so that you can have more venture capital in clean tech, so that you can have the right environment, so that clean tech is not then trying to compete alongside fossil fuel subsidies, which makes absolutely no sense. And you need more of that to be able to scale it up. And then perhaps on just the individual perspective, you also need to make it become a reality for people. I personally am very bad with technology. So I think if you want also more of these solutions and more broader based support for all of these solutions, you need to also really have that climate education that Jonas is talking about, to understand how can this benefit my life, what's in it for me, and also not stay purely in this kind of altruistic hope that everyone will want to act altruistically, because that's not how everyone works. And sometimes you need to make it very, anthropocentric, to make sure that people actually embrace the right behavioral changes.
Yeah, I think the idea that we all move together, selflessly, I'm not sure. I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I've got much personal experience of that. Sadly, I mean, aligned self-interest is, maybe people hate that as a concept, but it makes sense to me. Okay, so just to wrap up, so lots of really interesting points, and of course these are all sort of teasers, really, and hopefully people listen to those and be super interested and go away and work and think hard about them and follow up with some of the references. So just to complete then, so my final question, which I've already talked about, is then this question of the single thing. So step outside of what you do and your professional life or whatever, but if we are in this bind, we do have emissions increasing, we are told by the IPCC, unless we make really dramatic, deep, immediate cuts, then we're going to lose the chance of 1.5. It's gone. So there's a huge urgency. So what single thing or what domain, what area do we think we need to be focusing on most? I mean, of course, there's not just one thing, but the point is where would you put your money? So who's going to go first? Kevin, you're right in that.
I think what immediately comes to mind and takes the least time is renovating buildings. It's the immediate solution to have energy efficiency, save an incredible amount of energy, and have kind of sustainable, durable, eco-friendly buildings. Just renovate them properly. I think that would be incredibly effective. And
have quality of life benefits and et cetera, et cetera. So,
yeah, it ticks all the boxes. If there's help to renovate a building, perhaps even if you look at all the transfer payments that the EU is thinking of doing, it would actually be much cheaper to just buy every single citizen a heat pump for their home, so that they have a piece of technology that's really beneficial energy efficiency wise, and so that they can actually kind of make sure that even the most vulnerable have it in their homes, right?
Thank you. Alessandro.
I would second what Kevin said. And by the way, Italy is doing it. We are doing it with the money that the EU and the other generous countries sent to my Italian fellow citizens. But from my perspective, I think that digitizing the energy grid in Europe is probably one other thing that can be done. I think the European Commission will be out soon with the strategy. We should have done it maybe 10 years ago collectively with the energy industry, but I think that will be a pretty strategic way to save finally energy and therefore emissions.
Thank you. Jonas, last word.
Yes, slightly less, maybe a bit more of a boring solution, but this is something that we always communicate to decision makers. Link any support of the government to having a, and this is for companies, I should say, because they're the biggest emitters. I think we have to look for the effect where we need to look, where we can find it. So the industry is a good one, I think, as the biggest emitter. I would link the support of governments to having a solid climate strategy as a company. I think it's mind-blowing that not all companies have this at this stage. And of course it can, I mean, it doesn't have to go overnight, but you can push a lot with this measure, and it makes sense. You want to give money to those that are helping the future, not to those that are not doing their share. So this would be an amazing. In Japan, they started doing it as also including it as a procurement criterion in their public procurement policies, and it works. Yeah, it's an easy measure that allows you to work with the front runners instead of the laggers.
Got it. So both sort of subsidies, tax incentives, but also procurement. All transfers. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you so much. So thank you, Jonas. Thank you, Alessandro. Thank you, Kevin. Very much enjoyed that. And now if we can go to our second set of people. So Piet, Stuart, and Honourine. Magically, you've appeared. That's fantastic. Great. So let us go. So Honourine, you were third on the picture because but of course you should be first in alphabetical order. So I think the same deal really is we really want to hear your perspective, in short form. So 4 minutes, 4 to 5 minutes of your perspective, and it's sort of, it's supposed to be nationally based, but nationally based and beyond. And so as we've talked about, you've got an interesting position. You're all Belgium based. So if we can start with you, then we'll move to Piet and then Stuart.
Okay, thank you very much for the floor. I would like to begin by introducing myself. I'm Tambe Honourine Enow. I'm a Cameroonian, but I reside in Belgium. I'm a PhD student in climate change and sustainable development policies at the University of Lisbon, Portugal, and I'm researching I'm simulating the water, energy, food nexus in Africa for sound policy decision making. And I also hold a postgraduate diploma in weather and climate modeling from Ghent University, and a master's degree in environmental engineering also from Ghent University. I'm currently sitting on the advisory board of the United Nations Climate Technology Center Network, representing the youth constituency of the UNFCCC. And of course, this UN body, the CTCN, is responsible for climate technology transfer to developing countries to address issues relating to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. And I'm also the founder of a youth-led organization in Africa, currently in 22 African countries, called Africa Climate and Environment Foundation. And we are focused on mobilizing and empowering African youths to take actions for the climate, the environment, and for sustainable development that will help bridge the hunger and poverty gap, mitigate climate change, protect the environment, and conserve natural resources in Africa. Actually, although I live in Belgium and I have experienced my fair share of climate change impacts, although it's not as intense as it's in developing countries like Cameroon, but we can't completely deny the fact that developed countries are also experiencing the impacts of climate change. In Belgium, for example, this year, I think between July and August, we had very significant increase in temperature that I've never experienced before. Like, it was so unbearable for every other person, although not everybody experienced flooding and so on, but everybody in Belgium experienced that temperature increase. And for some of us or other young people that or I would say other people, everybody that is not having air condition or a very technology smart buildings and so on, climate smart buildings, the impact was more intense for them. And you all would agree with me that when it comes to those working blue-collar jobs, their working environments are not built, are not constructed in such a way that they can easily adapt to situations like that. And houses, most houses in Belgium are not built in such a way that they can adapt to the impacts of climate change relating to increasing temperatures. And I really do not know the policies in place in Belgium because I'm not focusing on policy, I'm focusing technology and implementation of technologies, especially when it's with respect to developing countries. But on a personal note, I think the Belgian government is not really giving consideration into adaptation. And it's very, very obvious because adaptation is considered as something for developing countries. And a lot of focus is on mitigation and so on. Even when we go to the COPs and negotiations, you only hear most developing countries, and Belgium also inclusive, are always talking about mitigations and so on. But that's because they believe that adaptation is something for developing countries. But we all saw what happened this year in Belgium. And therefore, I believe Belgium has to step up when it comes to adaptation, taking actions with respect to adaptations to climate change and so on. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Piet?
Thank you, Sam. Hello to all the other people from the panel. I'm part of the Wood Architects. Wood Architects is an architecture firm with 6 architects and 1 person for administration. 2 of them are also climate reality ambassadors. My colleague Aline has just recently been trained on the online training of about Brazil, and I was trained in 2014 in Johannesburg. So I've been around for a while as a climate reality leader. Now the thing is, Wood Architects is also a member of the Shift, Jonas, and we're also on the board of a passive house platform. So that kind of frames a little bit what we're working in. But the main thing of Wood Architects is that we believe if we want to tackle climate change, that we have to build in wood. So that's a very simple way in covering all the efforts that we put in as Wood Architects. Now the most challenge that we have in Belgium, and I would like to refer to the answer that Kevin gave about the construction industry. The problem in Belgium is that we need to renovate 3.7 million homes by 2050. If we do some calculation, that means that we should renovate 100,000 homes per year. And knowing from my profession, we only have like 15,000 applications for renovating homes. So that means not even 15% of what has to be done. And another important thing is from those 15,000 renovations, it's only a small fraction that is energy-based renovation. So that means insulation, very roughly climate neutral renovation is not even maybe 1% of the 100,000 that we should do. So that means there is a huge challenge, and I think it's almost impossible to manage that by 2050. The good part is that by the time that we're all going to be finished with renovating to climate neutral buildings, homes, that most of those homes will be torn down or will be just worn out so that we cannot use them anymore. So, but that's, of course, it's a very huge challenge. And I think in Belgium, it's going to be impossible to manage that. A very important thing for us is even, and I kind of referred to what the president of the European Communion said about in 2019 in the State of the Union about bio-based economy. And I think Kevin and Alessandro and Jonas also talked about decarbonization. Well, I think that's a perfect thing to do when you talk about bio-based construction. And but we with the wood architects even go further than the bio-based economy, because we talk about carbon sequestration. So with our office in the last 10 years, we managed to we are responsible in the designing our buildings for a lower emission of 8,800 tons over the last, I think, 8 years. But on top of this, so that means by choosing for wood, we don't emit, we emit less carbon dioxide, but on top of this, we also have 8,800 tons of carbon sequestration. And I think that's the biggest opportunity that we have to tackle climate change, is if we switch towards bio-based economy. And then in particular in the construction industry, we might be able to unbalance the carbon cycle in the atmosphere in a positive way, because we actually start taking out carbon dioxide, and we don't need any high industrial process for this. We just can do it by motivating our customers by building in wood. And I know a lot of people think building in wood will cut too many trees. Actually, those 8,800 tons carbon sequestration that we did in the last 8 years is regrown within 5.8 minutes in the European forests. So that means that we can, and I want to refer to the Potsdam Institute, the report that they recently published a few weeks ago, where they claim that we might rebuild all our cities in wood by 2100 and not even affect any ecosystem like the rainforest or any other space that we need for agriculture. So for me, the biggest challenge is, okay, bio-based economy, but even go further with this and talk about carbon sequestration. Okay, please.
Very clear, thank you. Stuart.
Okay, thanks. Let's quickly do a sound check. Are you hearing me okay? Okay. Quick warning, I have some neighbours who are actually doing a house restoration right next to me, so if you hear any sounds in the background, that's what it'll be about.
Are they using wood, Stuart?
Some, actually, some. Well, first of all, Sam and the Walk2COP27 team, thanks very much for the opportunity to participate today. Briefly introducing myself. So I'm an Englishman by origin, but I've been living in Belgium for 21 years in Alta in East Flanders. Also now, since Brexit, a Belgian citizen. I'm an engineer by background, so I started my career in telecoms, R&D, and I was very developing, in fact, optical fibre systems. So I was very interested in Alessandro's references to the role of fibre optics. Through a series of steps, I've progressively got into project and program management, and I've acted as a management consultant to many global corporations in many sectors, including telecoms, including pharma, including oil and gas. So I've seen some of that side of the story as well. And I'm currently active in automotive. I've also spent around 3 years supporting the growth of a clean tech venture in France, which had some really cool lithium battery recycling technology. So I've also dipped my foot in the sort of clean tech world. Now, from a climate perspective, I think that the really interesting step in my climate story started 3 years ago. I'm sure we all remember clearly the "How Dare You" speech from Greta Thunberg at the United Nations Climate Action Summit. I was personally very touched by that in two ways. Positively, because finally someone was calling out the madness in a very clear way. But also, I did feel a sense of shame of the past actions of my generation and generations before me, and also the current inaction of my generation. So I started looking from the point of view of, if Greta walked in the door right now, what would I say to her to explain what I'm doing in response to the very clear challenge she's laid out for us? And I think I also owe that explanation to my children, who are now young adults, and their contemporaries. So at this point in time, I was in the middle of a house restoration project. So I was very interested to hear the references of the other panelists relating to the potential of house restoration. But I thought, right, okay, I'm going to look in detail at what the beneficial impact of this restoration. What does it actually mean in numbers? So we all understand it's a numbers game. And I genuinely shocked myself. I realised that the project I was undertaking had the potential to save over 16 tonnes of CO2 emissions per year for our family. That really shocked me in terms of the scale of that number. So this was during the COVID period. We all had a bit more time in our hands. So I started thinking about what could I do to translate those experiences into something that could scale up to a much bigger level. And I also started thinking, how could I use some of my professional experience as a program manager, remembering that program management is all about delivering maximum benefits. Normally we measure that in euros or dollars, but what if we start to measure that in tons of CO2 instead of dollars? What difference might that make? So then, I suppose, to bring it back to a Belgian perspective, I'm actually a member of the Project Management Institute, the PMIs. This is a global organisation representing project professionals on a global basis. And just over a year ago, the PMI in Benelux were running a sustainability event. And this gave me an opportunity to present some of my thoughts, both at individual and sort of professional level of climate action. And in fact, it was during the preparation for this event I first met Sam and got some really great guidance, sources and review for that preparation. The reaction I got was a very positive one. My Benelux colleagues were, the thoughts were well received, lots of encouragement, and it made me think this is probably a way I should be sort of focusing my future career, or future steps in my career going forwards. And then more recently, I was invited to present at a local business event in my hometown of Alter. And here I thought I'd take a much more business-focused view for this particular audience. So putting side by side the financial business case for the steps in my house, my personal activities on the house, alongside the carbon environmental case. And for this audience, it was a very, very new thing. They'd not really seen this, and again received some quite positive feedback and good encouragement. Now, the thoughts that went into that, in fact, I'll be using that as a basis for the Clubhouse event that I'll be running on the 17th of October. So certainly welcome presence from anyone on the call. Please come and join. But in particular, I was interested in some of the other panelists' comments. Honorine's comments about airco, the heat effects in Belgium. Actually, one of the quality of life benefits I've got out of doing this restoration project was beautifully cool summers for the last 2 years. So that was a side benefit that really I'd not originally intended, not really originally anticipated. And also Piet's comments about the use of wood. I think if I were to do the project again, I would think a lot more about wood and get even more benefits in it. But anyway, more about that perhaps in the Clubhouse event on the 17th. That's probably enough by way of introduction.
Brilliant, thank you, Stuart. So, Honourine, I'd like to come to you. We've heard obviously Kevin talking about justice, and that's obviously closely, aligned to where the challenges are being felt and who caused them. It's very interesting that you're talking about the fact that Belgium now is feeling, just as the UK is as well, with the heat. I didn't really mention that, but obviously we had incredibly hot summer, and the idea that might be getting more and more and hotter as opposed to just a one-off, it can be quite unsettling, if not terrifying, actually, to some people. So I suppose my question to you is, because you're thinking about that transfer of climate technology to Africa, as an example, and I'm sure that by doing that, you've had conversations in economies like Belgium, and probably Belgium specifically, about whether people want to support it and how they think about it. So my question to you is, if and as the developed nations, or so-called developed economies, the richer economies, as we experience more direct climate impact, do you think that's going to make us more or less interested in the whole concepts of loss and damage and reparations, etc.?
Okay, thank you very much for this question. I think this question came up at the during the advisory board meeting of the United Nations Climate Technology Center Network, and it came from the representative of the least developed countries. He asked, we are all experiencing loss and damage at the moment, so who should pay for loss and damage? Both developed countries and developing countries are experiencing loss and damage. But the response is, the answer is very obvious. The developed countries have to pay for loss and damage. Now, when we look at the concept of loss and damage, loss and damage is experienced in different magnitude. You cannot compare the loss and damage in Belgium to that in, let's say, Lokoja in Nigeria. Belgium, the government of Belgium has a system in place that can assist their citizens when they experience loss and damage. They have a working system. Now, when you go to a country like Cameroon or a community like Douala, or let's say Nigeria, because they recently experienced flooding in Lokoja, the capital city of Kogi State. Now, if you look at the houses, they are all submerged in water. And Nigeria, I don't think Nigerian government has any plan or has any resources kept in place for those people that have lost those resources, their resources in their sources of their livelihood and everything, income sources. But if a situation, I believe last year, a situation like that happened in Belgium, in Liège, and those people were catered for. But this is not the case in developing countries. I'm saying this out of experience because I work directly with grassroots youth. Last year, for example, while Belgium was experiencing flooding and the government was responding to those who were impacted by flooding, a community in Sierra Leone, Kailahon, was experiencing windstorms and the schools were brought down, houses were brought down completely, and we didn't see any government response. We, the local youth-led organizations, went there, tried to evacuate the people and so on, but we had no resources to provide them with shelter. And until today, those people have not been settled. But that's not the case with those who had flooding in Belgium. I believe they have been compensated. So it's about the magnitude. When it happens, who can easily recover from it? Yes,
so Honourine, I'm not actually asking about who should, because I agree with you. It's just a question of capability, let alone a question of who caused it. It's actually a question of capability, perhaps first and foremost, and the recognition that somebody else's short-term issues is our issue in the longer term, right? So I think those two things combined. I guess my question is really though, do you think it will forward the conversation because people begin to better understand and have empathy, or it could retard it because it's like, well, I've got these huge unknown liabilities and challenges in my own backyard, so I'm just going to focus on that. So the question is less who should, but how do you think it plays out? Do you
need the perception? Yeah. Okay, I think based on what Belgium is experiencing now, though, I think it will give them an open eye on what those people down there also have been experiencing and they have been ignoring in Belgium or other developed countries. Until you experience a pain, you will not understand the magnitude of the pain that another person is complaining about. So because Belgium and other developed countries are now experiencing what those people down there have been experiencing for years, it will give them they will have a rethink on some of their policies or some of their actions that they have been taking with respect to addressing loss and damage for those on the ground in developing countries. So I think it's going to have a positive influence. That's if they are not going to use the fact that we are also experiencing loss and damage, so there's no need to pay for another person's loss and damage, because that's another problem that's coming up as a result of loss and damage in developed countries.
Okay, fingers crossed. Fingers crossed you're right. I hope so.
Yeah.
Okay, so Piet, question for you. So it sounds like, you've got a solution for a big part of this. It's potentially the most important, according to Kevin. It's not exactly new. So how, as you said, it's 15% of the amount that is required. And I'm not sure if the 15% was all wood or not. Maybe that was just, adaptation of any shape or form. But any which way, it's a small number. So how do we change that to 200%? Because 2050 is too far away. We're sort of all beginning to understand that anyway. So how do we fundamentally change it?
It changes by attitude, I guess. That is a very difficult question to answer because 35 years ago, when I graduated from college, I talked about building in wood. And it was quite a discussion about the fact if I would be able to finish my thesis or not. So it was not an issue back then. And even though the Club of Rome already made his report 10 years before that, it's been an issue for the last 40, 50 years. And the older people in the panel remember the car-free Sundays and the first oil problem in the 70s. It's always been an issue. The thing is, it's easier to in the short term. It's easier to continue the way you're doing it. The thing is that people are not capable in thinking in the long term. So I think people need to be motivated to do things today that might affect only has its effect in 20 years or maybe for the other generation. So if I build a home today and I build it for the next 30 years and I don't spend a lot of money on insulation, I can build a bigger house, I can build a more fancy house. But after 20, 30 years, my income raises, so I can afford the raise, the higher prices of energy. If I don't decide today to go all the way and go climate neutral, we will never be able to change it. So the only thing we can do is motivate the financial world also, because nowadays people cannot afford building a home anymore because they need to spend. They need to have 20% of the total cost of the building from their own, because they can only have a mortgage for 80%, and that doesn't depend on it's going to be a highly energy efficient building or not. It really doesn't make any difference. Even though we know by now that energy prices are very high, it's better to have a very good insulated or passive house building because you won't pay anything for energy. When I compare my house to other houses, I only pay 10% of the energy price, like the other people do. But it costs me double of the price to build it. So that's the thing. People need to be, when it comes to climate, the climate change, people need to think in a long term that even exceeds your lifetime, and it goes to other generations. I'm not building for myself anymore. I'm building for my children and my grandchildren. I don't want to hook them up with waste. I don't want to hook them up with a building that has to be torn down after 20 years because the engine or the energy efficiency is not well anymore. But I think that's the biggest challenge.
Okay, so in terms of how to address that, it's difficult to force people to think about the long term. So I guess there's two things. You mandate it in some shape or form, or you incentivize it through financial instruments of some shape or form, which you mentioned, right? And if, we're getting such amazing savings on energy consumption, you would have thought there's an opportunity for, an intermediary, or I don't know, maybe it's happening in Belgium, maybe people know about it happening at other places, but somebody to go in and part own or take responsibility for the energy consumption of that building. You could own it and you could sell
in Belgium, I think that's very typical for many countries. Having a big home or a fancy home is a status. It's good for the ego. You can show to people that you're successful. As long as energy efficiency is not, and give me a chance to put it this way, is not sexy enough, people want to do it. You should actually need to have an indication on your home, like you have it on cars now, and not anymore talk about the fancy level of your home, but about the energy efficiency of your home. If you would be able to do that, that would be the next level of status of showing off, showing your success in life. But that's a very emotional thing. It's so difficult to even talk about this.
Do you see any hope? Do you see changes in the marketplace with other products that people are beginning to value that as a characteristic of their lifestyle?
Look to the story of Tesla. Everybody wanted to have a Tesla because it was energy efficient, was on electricity, and ran on the sun, and he managed to do that.
Yeah. Okay, so we look forward to hearing about you as the new Tesla equivalent with wood. So
yeah,
I think that's going to work. But you didn't mention policy, which I'm intrigued by. So you don't think sort of mandating it in some shape or form or through tax?
Well, maybe I'm pessimistic, but I know Belgium doesn't have a lot of money. They have an extremely complex government, and that sucks up a lot of money, tax money. So incentives, if they give an incentive with the left hand, they have to take it with the right hand. Those things really don't work in Belgium because the country is way too complex. So I don't expect anything from policy.
Okay, that's got you. Okay, so super interesting. So obviously then Stuart, who's actually, been there, thinking about his own domain, is it very private domain, where the emissions come from, what to do about it. So Stuart, same question for you. Okay, so you've taken it almost as a hobby, which has become a mission almost, or maybe started as a mission. And you've seen the benefits. You probably did have to put quite a lot of money up front, but what reflections have you got on the back of those 3 years? How can this be scaled? And does it have to be scaled on people who can afford it? How does it get scaled to people who can't? How do we get those benefits?
I think when I talk with friends, colleagues about the experience I've been through, a lot of them get it really quickly. Once you can explain the benefits, both I suppose primarily the quality of life benefits, the financial benefits, those are the things that make them immediately prick their ears up. But if on top of that, it's also the right thing to do, it's a good thing to do, it becomes a no-brainer. And a lot of the people I've spoken to have immediately gone away and done something. A colleague I spoke to just a couple of months ago has now got a whole pile of solar panels on his roof already. When people get it, they take the right steps. Particularly, I suppose a lot of my colleagues, professional colleagues who can afford these kind of things, they have the means to be able to do it. So I think we need to make it possible for people to understand that story, and I suppose that's partly a reason why I wanted to do the Clubhouse event, because it might just open up that debate to a slightly wider group of people. But also I think we just do need to find ways of, I think some elements come out of it. I think, like, for example, solar, particularly with the cost of energy now. What was previously, 6+ year payback time is now become 4, even 3 year payback time. It's become an almost absolute no-brainer. If you've got space on your roof, in Belgium, it's a very good thing to do to stick solar on your roof and benefit from it. Now, I realise not everyone has a roof and not everyone has the funds to invest in it. So I think this is where again, back to Piet's comment about the finance side, I think is a very important one. If for those who can't afford it, if there's other mechanisms, and in fact, I just heard of, I got some publicity just today from a solar panel company in Belgium who seems to be proposing some alternative model of somehow shared ownership or subscription model to ease the initial financial pain of putting the panels on your roof. There's an initiative that I think Nicole Rosberg is heading up in the UK called Tesseract, where you can own a virtual solar panel by effectively taking shares in this new venture that deploys solar panels on a broader basis. I think that this is a tremendous way forward, because it both helps people to benefit from lower cost energy in the short term, but also by investing in getting more energy capacity out there, at a national level, it's reducing dependency on fossil fuel imports from the likes of Russia. And so it's strategically, I think, a good thing to do, as well as a good thing to do individually, as well as a good thing to do for the environment.
Okay, so can I try and sort of paraphrase just to say, so, you know, there is a proportion of people who can afford it, and in which case they just need to be educated, because they're the benefits, and you're playing into something they sort of want to do anyway, but they might not do unless you have the quality of life and the financial benefits. Yeah. And then you've got the need for new business models on the other segment to basically think about how you smooth the costs and the benefits effectively, because otherwise it's all upfront, right? The cost.
Yeah. And in fact, relating to that, I've seen the recent response both in the UK and Belgium to how to help people struggling with energy costs. You know, I don't want to make this a sort of political discussion, but I must say I'm personally very disappointed to see that the reactions seem to be, how do we help people? How do we basically subsidise the fossil fuel companies by helping them pay their bills? I think that's a tremendous opportunity missed, where that same money could be put into how do we help those people invest in having free energy in the future, as well as having a greater home capacity for generating energy.
Yeah, and I think just to some extent, I know, coming from the corporate world, just as you do, you know, we're not used to straying into political comment in our professional lives. But I think as you move into, you know, increasingly into being interested and concerned around climate change, of course it's political, and you can't avoid it, and you can't duck it. It just is. And we've just seen that with our, you know, our new Prime Minister, and the fracking, and, you know, the interest in oil and gas, you know, again, and it's yeah, it's highly political, and it shouldn't be. It's highly politicized. Yeah. So depoliticizing that is super important. Okay, so before we get to my favorite question, which is the last one, which is, you know, step outside of your personal experience, what one thing, right? Before we go there, Honourine, I just want to take the opportunity to ask you, because you have obviously got your experience and your network. Some of your networks are youth specific, and they're sort of African youth specific as well. So any just sort of reflections on, you know, what does that feel like? What are that? I'm lucky enough to be engaged with some, like Youngo, etc., through this initiative at the moment. I'm struck by the energy. I'm struck to some extent by the optimism. There's some anger there as well. But really, I'm asking you, what are the sort of, what would boil to the surface in terms of what they're trying to get us to understand and know?
Sorry, I didn't get the last part of the question.
So as you know, that experience of those networks that you're involved with and engaging with, what do you think they want to tell us? You have an opportunity here just to, you know, say a couple of things that you think they would want us to hear.
Okay, I would focus on African youth. And of course, when I say African youth, I'm talking about youth in the Global South. And I believe for the youth from the Global South, we all have the same voice, the same language that we are trying, or the same message we are trying to communicate, because it's obvious that our needs or our impacts on the impacts we get from climate change is completely different from those from the Global North. And what we want is implementation on the ground. We are tired of going to conferences and insisting we want this, we want that, or holding placards on the streets and saying we want this, we want that. We want to actually take actions on the ground. We want to effect change on the ground. We have the capacity, we have the capabilities, we have educated youths, exposed youths that have amazing ideas that they want to implement, but they lack the necessary support from people like you. They don't have people that are ready to push them, and they don't have people that are ready to showcase what they are doing on the ground. But when they hold placards and all that, then you see media houses picking that up. But when what they are doing on the ground to address issues in their communities, nobody's talking about that. So young people really want you to go. They want everybody to go on the ground and see what they are doing and try to support them. We have a lot of them in our quote Africa, for example. They have been doing undertaking amazing initiatives. For example, the youth I'm working with in my organization, Africa Climate and Environment Foundation, every month they have 2 days that they conduct sensitization campaigns twice a month. And they go to marketplaces where their target population is women. They go to schools where their target population is children and youth, and they use radios and other media channels to disseminate information. But nobody's talking about that. And when you go typically to a typical community in Africa, they don't know. They know they are being affected. Something is wrong. They understand that there is the impact of climate change, but they don't know what climate change is about. They don't even know what's causing those impacts. They don't even know how their actions is contributing to that impact. And they don't even know the strategies they can use to adapt to that impact. And they don't know the strategies they can use to mitigate those impacts. And these young people on the ground have taken upon themselves to educate, conduct awareness campaigns in schools, in marketplaces, parks, everywhere that there's gathering. And they don't receive the support for large scale of such to conduct large scale such campaigns. These same young people have been engaged intensely in nature-based solution to address climate change with respect to adaptation and mitigation. You will see youth-led organization, youth groups, they go to the forest and plant trees and so on, economic trees, and they train their parents, their community members and so on how to maintain those trees. You see them going to mangroves and plant mangroves. We all understand the carbon sequestration capacity of the mangrove ecosystem. It's like 5 times that of terrestrial vegetation. And those ecosystems, like the mangrove ecosystems, are being highly deforested in Africa. And we see these young people going there, restoring those mangrove ecosystems, and they train women. They now have women groups and youth groups that are actually restoring large-scale mangrove ecosystems. For example, in Kenya, we have youths that are restoring mangrove from Kenya, the Diani Beach in the Mombasa, right up to Tanzania. But you don't hear this out there. You see young people, they encourage women. You see them going to the ocean with women and encourage them to plant seaweeds. And these seaweeds is like a form of alternative sources of livelihood for these women. And these seaweeds help in carbon sequestration. Not only that, it also helps in water purification. And the seaweeds can be used in the production of bioplastics. And nobody's talking about that, because they are not out here holding placards and showing to the world, we want this, we want that. So there are a lot of initiatives. You see other young people on the ground, they train women and youths on how to craft plastics to use useful products. And you don't hear this on media. You don't see nobody supporting them. So these young people really want your support, not just on like asking what they have been doing or asking on the policy, in terms of policy and so on. They want support in terms of implementation to strengthen the resilience of their communities.
Okay.
They want support in terms of implementation to provide alternative sources of livelihood in their communities so that their parents or relatives and so on can stay away from nature that is helping in carbon sequestration and so on. That's what these young people want. Thank you.
That's a message to all of us, definitely. And I think, it needs interest, it needs us to educate ourselves, and it needs us to act in some shape or form. And one of the things we can do, obviously, Honourine won't be the only thing, but certainly in terms of links, some useful links, I can stick those obviously in when I post about this, and that might help in a very, very small way. But I hear you. Thank you for that. So just to wrap up, so Piet, over to you then. How do we save the world? What's your one top ask? Is it to do with wood and architecture, or is it outside of that and something completely different?
Sure. Now, I won't do any math anymore about calculations, but if we really focus on carbon sequestration and bio-based economy, then I'm definitely sure that we can solve a big part of the climate change. Can we solve everything? Well, probably not, but it's not my intention either to solve the whole climate change by myself. For me, the most important thing, and for the team of wood architects, the most important thing is that we can build in wood. And the good thing of an architect is when you build something, it stays there for a long time. So you can show it, and you can talk about the difference that it makes. The other thing is that I would like to accomplish, as together with the team of wood architects, is that we can spread out our legacy. And the legacy is much more than the technology about building with wood, but there's all the environment around it. That's the 17 SDGs that we try to implement, but also the way of thinking, the way of acting. We're not only builders of wooden houses, we need to project that on our personal life and our social life. And that's what we would like to do. But first of all, do the things first, and then show what you have done. I think that's the most effective way.
And okay, and then just what is the other, over and above wood? What's the most obvious example of a sort of bio-based or bio-backed approach?
You mean an architecture or whatever?
Yeah, whatever. Yeah.
Well, bio-based is very simple. The resources, you start with resources that regrow. So everything that you need is like, there is already technology to make wood transparent, so you can replace glass by wood. There are so many things. There are even a technology about batteries that you make from rhubarb, something that grows in your yard or in your garden. Everything that is needed as a resource for an industrial process, you should need to think in a way of, is it regrowable and is it bio-based? Like insulation from flags or from wool or whatever. Bamboo, for example, is also such a very interesting material. And you don't need to use that only in construction, you can use that in so many other things. So I think bio-based economy is something that we can implement everywhere without any exclusion.
Okay. Thank you. Stuart?
Well, personally, I think it's all about scaling up individual action on a massive scale. So I think the example of what I went through, let's just get that global, would be my view. There are some existing global initiatives out there from the UN, from Counter-CN. There's some really great initiatives out there. How do we make these scale up and just deliver things on a much bigger level? Now, what I think might be an area that I want to explore a little bit more over the coming months is building upon. I've basically spent the last 5 years, although I've been working for an automotive company, it's been with financial systems in the automotive company. Having met with financial people, these people are very good at taking numbers and adding them up into much bigger numbers. My personal feeling is that there's something there where the tools, techniques and talents of the finance industry could really somehow help. I've not quite worked out exactly how, and I'm sure there's others who are much further down this thought than I am. But it's something I will certainly be thinking more about and knocking some ideas around with my colleagues and clients to explore what might be possible. I think a lot of the thinking is already there. We just need to start counting carbon instead of counting euros.
So, but the point about the financial industry is to bring in some of the solutions we talked about earlier, to stimulate, to incentivize, to
Well, no, actually, no. Looking at it from a different perspective, there's a climate in the finance industry, of course, needs to provide the finance to fund the projects. That's one thing. That's an output from the finance industry. Yeah. But also the tools and techniques. The fact you do a financial business case, the fact you do a financial investment. One of the things I'll be going into in the clubhouse is there's a direct parallel between that and the carbon investments and the life cycle of a project from a carbon perspective. And there's some of the things that I think Piet's talking about in the sequestration and stuff, the embodied carbon at the front end of your project. All of these things are direct parallels to the way you look at a project from a financial perspective. So I think applying financial techniques to the life cycle of a carbon investment, I personally think is an area of quite a lot of interest, and you can add up all those individual contributions to a national level, where you might want to start messing around with taxation, to a global level, where you start to make a real big impact. And looking at this from a numbers perspective, I mean, if you just look at the 16 tons of CO2 savings that I made, I'm aiming to use my links within the Project Management Institute. It represents around 3 million project professionals globally. It supports them. If I could somehow persuade each of those 3 million people, okay, it's a big number, but these are people who within their communities are probably relatively affluent people who probably could afford to make some personal investments. 3 million times 16 is 50 million tons of CO2 savings per year, and that's 0.1% of the total global target of 50 billion tons of CO2 per year we need to save. So when you start to scale things up, you start to take a bite-sized lump out of some of these very, very big numbers. And I think that's the area where I just want to play around a bit with my PMI colleagues and with my finance industry colleagues and see where it goes, really.
Yeah, and you mentioned one thing, which is, of course, at a national level, that can then contribute to people's NDCs. So if the NDCs are taken very, very seriously and they are binding, then of course, countries are going to be looking at any which way that they can demonstrate that they've reduced their footprint. And there's various different ways to do that, but one of them certainly is to stimulate the type of activity you're talking about.
Well, if you can't measure it, how can you deliver the results? I mean, that's why I know you ask often a question about optimism versus pessimism. As an individual, I'm optimistic we can solve this because I believe in the massive powers of humans to overcome huge obstacles. But as a program manager, if I put my sort of program management hat on, right now, I'm not seeing those graphs that show this is where we are now, this is where we need to get to. Here's the graph that gets us there. Here's our year-by-year tracking of where we are against that graph. Well, in fact, I'm not seeing that going in a positive direction. When we do hear reference to this, all I'm hearing is that each year we're emitting more carbon instead of less carbon. So, there's some really sort of significant work we need to do in this area quickly to get this into a much better place. So I think real mass action is what's required on a global scale.
Got it. Last word, Honourine?
Last word, I'm still going to repeat that we should focus more on adaptation and loss and damage. We should at least have some considerations for those who are already experiencing the impacts, and we should also consider the magnitude of these impacts and the ability to recover from such impacts, from any episodes that they might experience. And I'm still going to stress on building capacity of those on the ground to be able to adapt to climate change impacts. Yeah, provide them with the necessary resources to implement the necessary technologies that will help them adapt at that grassroots level. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you, everybody. Very much enjoyed the different points of view. I think anybody listening will be informed and educated, which is great, which is part of what we're trying to do. Please, again, everybody, do have a look at the website. So www.walk2COP27.com. And in there, you'll find those different ways to participate. So like joining the walk, sitting in another town hall, joining the clubhouse sessions that Stuart's given. And remember, yeah, the more people we can get, the more we can amplify the stories, the more we can just sort of push this and push the great suggestions and ideas that just bubble up, and they bubble up from all walks of life. It's great. It's really, really stimulating. So thank you very much indeed. Have a good afternoon.
Yep, thanks.
Cheers, Jonas.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Yeah, Stuart, you can go back to your migration now, mate.
Cheers, Sam.
Cheerio.